The dust rose in thick clouds behind the prison wagon, coating everything in a fine layer of Texas grit that settled into the creases of Sarah Mitchell's dress and clung to the moisture at the corners of her eyes. She rode her mare alongside the rattling convoy, maintaining a steady pace despite the relentless afternoon sun that beat down on the parched landscape. The soldiers paid her little mind now, after 3 days of her persistent presence. At first they had tried to dissuade her, then to ignore her, and finally they had simply accepted that she would follow, though none of them understood why. Sarah herself wasn't entirely certain of her reasons. When the military wagon had rolled through Sweetwater carrying its cargo of defeated Comanche warriors, something had compelled her to saddle her horse and trail behind. Perhaps it was the weight of all she had lost, or perhaps it was the peculiar emptiness that had settled into her bones since the fever had taken her husband and both children within the span of a single terrible week. The preacher had told her that time would heal her wounds, but 6 months had passed and she felt no different. She existed in a strange haze, moving through her days like a ghost haunting her own life. The prison wagon was little more than a cage on wheels, its iron bars casting striped shadows across the faces of the men within. There were 7 of them, Comanche warriors who had been part of a raid on a settlement 40 miles south. The raid had been a desperate act, Sarah had heard, a final attempt by a starving band to secure food and horses as their traditional hunting grounds shrank and disappeared. 3 settlers had been killed. Now these men were being transported to Fort Concho, where they would face trial and almost certain execution. She had been watching them for 3 days without really seeing them as individuals. They were simply figures in her peripheral vision, part of the landscape of her aimless wandering. But on the 4th day, as the sun reached its apex and the heat became almost unbearable, she found herself studying them more carefully. Most sat with their heads bowed, their long dark hair obscuring their faces. Their hands were bound, and chains connected them to iron rings welded to the floor of the wagon. One man, however, sat differently. He held himself upright despite his bonds, his gaze fixed on the horizon as though he could see beyond it to some distant place that still held meaning. Their eyes met quite by accident. Sarah had been adjusting her hat against the sun's glare when she glanced toward the wagon, and he had turned his head at precisely that moment. The connection lasted only a second before she looked away, her heart suddenly racing for reasons she couldn't name. But something in that brief exchange had cracked open the numbness she had been carrying. That evening, when the convoy made camp, Sarah dismounted and tended to her horse as she had done every night. The soldiers built their fire and prepared their meal of salt pork and beans. She made her own small fire some distance away and ate the dried meat and hardtack she had brought from town. The prisoners received no food that evening, as one of the soldiers had explained to her earlier. They were fed every other day to preserve supplies. It seemed cruel to Sarah, though she said nothing. What right did she have to object? She was merely a widow on a horse, following a prison wagon for reasons she couldn't articulate even to herself. As darkness fell and the camp settled into an uneasy quiet, Sarah found herself unable to sleep. She lay on her bedroll, staring up at the vast expanse of stars that seemed close enough to touch in the clear desert air. The prisoners were quiet too, though she could hear the occasional clink of chains when one of them shifted position. The guards had posted 2 sentries who paced the perimeter of the camp, their rifles held ready. She must have dozed eventually, because she woke to the sound of commotion. Sitting up quickly, Sarah saw that one of the prisoners had collapsed in the wagon. The guards were shouting, and in the confusion and firelight, she couldn't make out what was happening. One of the soldiers unlocked the wagon and climbed inside, checking the fallen man. After a moment, he emerged and called to the officer in charge. "Dead, sir. Looks like his wounds went bad." Sarah remembered then that several of the prisoners had been injured when they were captured. In the chaos of the arrest and the harsh conditions of transport, infection must have set in. The soldiers dragged the body from the wagon and left it some distance from the camp. In the morning, they would bury it quickly and move on. Such was the efficiency of military justice. The incident left Sarah shaken in a way she hadn't expected. Death was no stranger to her. She had watched her own family slip away, had held their hands as their breathing grew shallow and ceased. But there was something about this casual disposal of a human being, this matter of fact acceptance of preventable suffering, that struck her as profoundly wrong. These men were prisoners, yes, and they would likely hang for their crimes, but they were still men. They still felt pain and fear and loss. The next morning, when the convoy prepared to move out, Sarah rode closer to the wagon than she had before. The warrior who had met her eyes the previous day was watching her again. This time she didn't look away. His face was angular and weathered, with deep lines around his eyes that suggested a life lived largely outdoors. A scar ran from his left temple to his jawline. His expression was unreadable, but there was an intelligence in his gaze that unsettled her. "You should not follow," he said suddenly, his English clear though heavily accented. Sarah was so startled that she nearly pulled her horse to a stop. None of the prisoners had spoken to her before, and she hadn't expected any of them to speak English at all. "Why not?" she asked before she could think better of engaging with him. "This path leads only to death. Why do you walk it with us?" She had no answer for him. The wagon rolled on, and the moment passed, but his question echoed in her mind throughout the day. Why was she following? What did she hope to find or accomplish? The soldier riding nearest to her gave her a suspicious look, clearly having overheard the exchange, but he said nothing. That evening, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. When the soldiers had settled into their evening routine and the light was fading, she approached the officer in charge, a weathered captain named Morrison, who had fought in the war between the states and had spent the last decade on the frontier. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "those men haven't eaten in 2 days. I have extra provisions. I'd like to share some with them." Morrison regarded her with a mixture of suspicion and something that might have been pity. "Mrs. Mitchell, these men are prisoners. They're accused of murder and theft. They'll hang within the month. Then what harm can it do to let them eat?" The captain studied her for a long moment, then shrugged. "I suppose it can't hurt, but you give it to them yourself. My men have enough to do." Sarah had not expected that condition, but she nodded. She went to her saddlebag and retrieved a portion of her dried meat, some hardtack, and a canteen of water. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the prison wagon. The guards watched her, but made no move to stop her. The prisoners regarded her with varying expressions: suspicion, curiosity, and in one case, what might have been gratitude. She distributed the food through the bars, giving each man an equal share. When she reached the warrior who had spoken to her, she found herself hesitating. "Why do you do this?" he asked quietly, taking the food she offered. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe because I've seen enough death. Maybe because mercy costs nothing." "Mercy is never without cost," he replied, "but it is rare. Thank you. What's your name?" The question surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. "I am called Nakona. It means one who travels. I'm Sarah." He nodded slowly, as though committing the name to memory. "Sarah, it is a strong name." She moved on to finish distributing the food, aware of Captain Morrison watching from across the camp. When she returned to her own fire, she felt less empty than she had in months. It was a small thing, feeding hungry men, but it was something. It was a choice she had made, an action she had taken. For 6 months she had been passive, allowing life to happen around her without participating in it. This felt different. Over the following days, a strange routine developed. Sarah continued to ride alongside the prison wagon, and each evening she shared portions of her food with the prisoners. The soldiers seemed uncomfortable with this arrangement, but didn't interfere. Nakona began to speak with her during the rides, their conversations brief but gradually becoming more substantial. He told her about his life before the reservation, before the buffalo disappeared and the world of his people began to collapse. He spoke of riding across plains that stretched forever, of hunts that could last weeks, of a way of life that had existed for generations and was now dying. There was no bitterness in his voice when he spoke, only a kind of resigned sadness that Sarah recognized. It was the same sadness she carried in her own heart, the grief of irrevocable loss. In turn, Sarah found herself talking about things she had not spoken of since her family died. She told him about her husband Thomas, who had been a schoolteacher with dreams of bringing education to the frontier. She described her children, Emma and James, who had been 6 and 4 when the fever took them. She spoke of the unbearable silence of her house afterward, and the way ordinary objects, a child's toy, a man's hat, could suddenly become weapons that pierced her heart. "You understand," Nakona said one afternoon as they traveled through a landscape of red rock and scrub brush. "You know what it is to lose your world." "Yes," Sarah replied simply, "I do. This is why you ride with us. You are also traveling toward death." His words should have frightened her, but instead they felt like truth. She had been moving through her days without purpose or direction, neither living nor quite dead. Following this prison wagon was perhaps the most honest expression of her state of being, suspended between two worlds, belonging to neither. "Are you afraid," she asked him, "of what's coming?" Nakona was quiet for a long time before answering. "I am afraid of being forgotten. My people are disappearing, and soon there will be no one left to remember how we lived, what we believed. The victors will write our story, and it will not be true." "Then tell me," Sarah said impulsively, "tell me your story. I'll remember it. I'll write it down." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Why would you do this?" "Because someone should. Because stories shouldn't die with the people who lived them." That evening, after the camp was made and the prisoners had been fed, Nakona began to speak. The other prisoners listened too, and sometimes they added their own voices to his, building a collective narrative of a world that was vanishing. Sarah took out the journal she had brought but rarely used and began to write. She filled page after page with their words, tales of great hunts and terrible battles, of sacred places and spiritual visions, of love and loss, and the complex web of relationships that had sustained their communities. Captain Morrison observed this new development with clear unease, but he didn't interfere. Perhaps he sensed, as Sarah did, that there was something important happening here, something that transcended the simple categories of prisoner and free, victor and vanquished. On the 8th day of their journey, as they were passing through a narrow canyon, riders appeared on the ridge above them. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat as she counted at least a dozen mounted warriors, their horses silhouetted against the bright sky. The convoy came to an abrupt halt, and the soldiers scrambled to form a defensive position, their rifles aimed upward. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. The warriors on the ridge remained motionless, watching. Then one of them called out in Comanche, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. Nakona stood in the prison wagon, his chains rattling, and called back. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but she could hear the emotion in both voices: desperation, sorrow, rage. "They want to free us," Nakona said quietly to Sarah, who had instinctively moved her horse closer to the wagon. "They are my brother's sons. But if they attack, everyone will die. The soldiers will kill us before they are killed themselves, and those young men will die for nothing." "What are you telling them?" Sarah asked. "I am telling them to let us go, that our time has passed, that they should ride away and live." The conversation continued, voices rising and falling. Sarah watched the young warriors on the ridge, seeing their anguish and frustration even at this distance. They were being asked to abandon their fathers and uncles to death, to ride away and do nothing. It was an impossible choice. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, warriors began to withdraw. One by one they turned their horses and disappeared beyond the ridge. The last to leave was the one who had called out initially, and Sarah thought she saw him raise his hand in salute before he too vanished. The soldiers remained tense for another hour as the convoy slowly made its way through the canyon, but there was no attack. When they finally reached open ground again, Captain Morrison rode back to where Sarah was positioned near the prison wagon. "What did he say to them?" the captain demanded, gesturing toward Nakona. "He told them to live," Sarah replied. "He told them to let go." Morrison stared at her for a long moment, then at Nakona, before riding back to the head of the convoy without another word. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat by her small fire, watching the stars wheel overhead and thinking about the warriors on the ridge. They had ridden away because Nakona had asked them to, but at what cost to their own hearts and spirits? How did one live with the choice to abandon those they loved, even when that choice was the right one? She became aware that Nakona was watching her from the wagon. The other prisoners were sleeping, but he sat upright, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Come closer," he said softly. "I want to tell you something." Sarah glanced at the guards, but they were at the far end of the camp, talking quietly. She moved to sit near the wagon, close enough to hear Nakona's low voice, but far enough to maintain propriety. "Why did you really start following us?" he asked. Sarah considered lying or deflecting, but Nakona had been honest with her. He deserved the same. "I think I was looking for a place to die," she said finally. "Not by my own hand. I couldn't do that. But I thought maybe, if I rode far enough into the emptiness, I might just fade away. Or maybe I would find some reason to keep living. I don't know which I was hoping for. And now, have you found your reason?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'm not ready to fade away yet. Listening to your stories, writing them down, it feels important. It feels like something worth doing." Nakona was quiet for a moment, then he did something that surprised her. He extended his bound hands through the bars of the wagon, reaching toward her. Without thinking, Sarah reached back, and their fingers touched briefly before she pulled away, suddenly conscious of how inappropriate the gesture was. "You have given me something unexpected," Nakona said. "You have given me a witness, someone who will carry our stories forward. This is a greater gift than food or water. It means we will not be forgotten." Tears stung Sarah's eyes, the first she had shed since her family died. "I will remember," she promised. "I'll write it all down, and I'll make sure others know the truth about who you were." Nakona repeated softly. "Yes, we are already speaking of ourselves in the past tense. The future belongs to others now." They talked late into the night, until the guards finally noticed and ordered Sarah back to her own fire. But something had shifted between them, a connection that transcended the bars and chains, the cultural divide, and the brutal circumstances. They had recognized in each other a fundamental loneliness, and in that recognition had found a kind of companionship. The remaining days of the journey passed quickly. Fort Concho appeared on the horizon on the morning of the 12th day, its adobe walls rising from the desert like a monument to conquest and control. Sarah felt a knot of dread forming in her stomach as they drew closer. She knew what would happen once they arrived. There would be a trial, perfunctory and predetermined. Prisoners would be sentenced to death, and within weeks, perhaps days, Nakona and the others would be executed. When the convoy passed through the fort's gates, Sarah dismounted and stood, uncertainly, her horse's reins in her hand. Captain Morrison approached her, his expression softer than it had been during most of their journey. "Mrs. Mitchell, you've come far enough. This is where you should turn back. Go home to Sweetwater. I need to see this through," Sarah said. "I need to witness what happens to them. There's nothing you can do for them now. The law will take its course, I know, but I promised I would remember. I can't remember properly if I leave now." Morrison sighed but nodded. "There's a boarding house in the civilian quarter. Mrs. Henderson runs it. Tell her I sent you. The trial will be tomorrow." Sarah thanked him and led her horse away from the military section of the fort. She found the boarding house and secured a room, then spent the rest of the day writing frantically in her journal, trying to capture every conversation, every story Nakona and the others had shared. Her hand cramped from the effort, but she pushed through, driven by the urgency of preservation. The trial the next day was exactly as perfunctory as she had feared. The prisoners were brought into the courtroom in chains, and the charges were read. There was no real defense offered, no witnesses called beyond those who testified to the raids and the deaths. The military judge listened impassively and delivered his verdict within an hour. Death by hanging, sentenced to be carried out in 3 days. Sarah sat in the back of the courtroom, her journal clutched in her hands, and watched as Nakona and the others received their sentence without visible reaction. Only at the end, as they were being led away, did Nakona turn and find her in the crowd. Their eyes met, and he nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgment and perhaps gratitude. She spent the next 2 days writing letters. She wrote to newspapers in Texas and beyond, telling the story of the Comanche prisoners and the humanity she had found in them. She wrote to government officials, pleading for clemency though she knew it was futile. She wrote to anyone who might listen, bearing witness to what she had seen and heard. On the 3rd day, she dressed carefully and made her way to the execution ground. A crowd had gathered: soldiers, civilians, people who had come to see justice done, others who simply wanted to watch men die. Sarah stood apart from them, near the back, her journal pressed against her chest. The prisoners were brought out one by one. Each was asked if they had final words. Most remained silent. When it was Nakona's turn to climb the scaffold, he paused and looked directly at Sarah. The story's live. He called out to her in English, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "You have made them live. Thank you, Sarah Mitchell." Then he ascended the steps, and Sarah had to look away as the noose was placed around his neck. She heard the trapdoor open, heard the collective gasp of the crowd, but she kept her eyes fixed on the distant horizon, on the vast empty sky that stretched beyond the fort's walls. When it was over and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah remained where she was. She felt hollowed out, scraped raw, but there was something else too, a sense of purpose that had been absent from her life for so long. Nakona had given her a task, to carry the stories forward, to be a witness, to ensure that he and his people were not forgotten. She stayed at the fort for another week, gathering more information, talking to anyone who would speak with her about the Comanche, their history, their culture, their current plight on the reservations. She filled 3 more journals with notes and observations. Then, finally, she prepared to return to Sweetwater. Before she left, she visited the fort's small cemetery where the executed prisoners had been buried in unmarked graves. She stood before the disturbed earth and spoke aloud, telling them that she would keep her promise, that their stories would be told and retold, that they would be remembered not as nameless criminals, but as men with lives and loves and dreams that had been crushed by forces beyond their control. The journey back to Sweetwater took 8 days. Sarah rode alone, but she felt less lonely than she had in months. The landscape seemed different now, filled with the echoes of the stories she carried. She saw the land not just as empty space, but as a place where entire civilizations had risen and flourished and were now disappearing. Every rock formation, every water hole, every stretch of prairie had meaning and history that most people would never know. When she reached her small house on the edge of town, Sarah didn't hesitate. She went directly to her desk, took out fresh paper, and began to write. She would write Nakona's story and the stories of his people. She would submit them to every newspaper and magazine that would publish them. She would become a voice for those who could no longer speak for themselves. As she wrote, Sarah realized that Nakona had given her something precious, a reason to keep living, a purpose that extended beyond her own grief and loss. In bearing witness to his death and remembering his life, she had found a way to honor both him and her own departed family. She would live, and she would remember, and in doing so, she would ensure that none of them, not Nakona, not her husband, not her children, would be truly forgotten. The desert wind rattled the windows of her small house, and Sarah paused in her writing to look out at the vast Texas landscape. Somewhere out there, young Comanche warriors were riding across what remained of their ancestral lands, carrying the weight of impossible choices and the grief of a dying world. And here she sat, a widow with a pen and paper, trying to preserve something essential before it vanished completely. She returned to her writing, her hand moving steadily across the page, setting down words that might outlast them all, testament to a brief connection between two people from different worlds who had found, in their shared understanding of loss, something approaching grace